Welcome to chemistry episode number 2, electrons. So for this episode, I'm just going to be representing nucleus of the atoms with N, just because we're talking about electrons this time, so it's not very important. We're going to be discussing the first, second, and third shells of an atom in this video. Now, the first shell of an atom, it can hold at most 2 electrons, and in this video I'll also be representing the electrons with E minus. That would be how you would represent them in chemistry. So the first shell can hold at most 2 electrons, so this first shell. And then the second shell, because remember shells work from inside to out, the second shell can at most hold 8 electrons, and the third shell can also at most hold 8 electrons. Now, in later chemistry, that's not going to be true, but for now, the third shell can at most hold 8 electrons. And now, we can worry about this later, the valence shell. Argon is an element on the periodic table, which we'll also discuss later, but argon has 18 protons. So if we're talking about a neutral atom of argon, which also has 18 electrons, because the 18 negative charges, 18 positive charges cancel each other out, draw an argon atom. So you pause the video now, draw in the electrons, so on the first, second, and third shell. And remember, electrons work their way in to out, right? So the electrons are first going to fill up the first shell, then the second shell, then the third shell. So pause the video right now and try it for yourself. Okay, now I'll reveal the answers. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to draw them with minus marks. So 1 here, 1 here, 1 here, 1 here, 1 here, 1 here. And finally, here. So, yeah, the electrons fill in all of the shells. Argon is an element where a neutral atom of argon fills in all of the shells, which means fills its valence shell, which now I'll talk about. The valence shell is just the outermost shell of an atom. So, for example, argon, the outermost shell will be the third shell, because it has 3 shells, right? So it'll be the third shell, would be the most outermost shell. Now, all elements want to do is complete their valence shell. And the electrons inside the valence shell, they're called valence electrons. So argon, all of these would be valence electrons, right? Here, 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 here. So yeah, so elements, they bond with other elements to complete their outermost shell, right? For argon, argon's outermost shell requires 8 electrons to be filled, right? But argon already has 8 electrons in its outermost shell, so argon doesn't react. That's why argon is part of the noble gases, which we'll also discuss later in chemistry episode number 3, the periodic table. So it's called noble because it doesn't react, right? It already has a full valence shell, so it's not going to react. Sometimes elements such as lithium has 1 valence electron. It's easier for lithium to lose a valence electron because, remember, its inner shells are already filled, right? Because electrons fill shells from inwards to outwards. So all lithium just loses 1 electron, so that its inner shells are already filled, so it loses that outermost shell. That outermost shell now becomes its inner shell that's already filled, right? we'll learn more about that in bonding and later episodes, but that's just a brief overview of chemical bonding because it has a lot to do with electrons and valence electrons. But I think that's going to be it for today's chemistry episode number 2, electrons. So our key takeaways: the first shell max 2 electrons, second shell max 8 electrons, third shell max 8 electrons. The outermost shell is called the valence shell, and all elements want to do, like all atoms want to fill their valence shell with electrons. And that's pretty much it. And I'll see you in chemistry episode number 3, the periodic table.